When I got the job, I had just graduated, grad school. And sadly, there wasn't a lot of demand for doctors in Cathedral City. Who knew? One would have thought they would need doctors even in the city of God, but it is what it is. So, with mounting student debt and rent that had to be paid in less than a month, I had to get a job, and fast. So, I went online to try to figure out what jobs were immediately hiring. Most of the ones that came up were some obvious fronts, waiters who needed to work or after hours, someone who could drive a truck without asking too many questions, construction workers who work only at night, things like that. But then I found something that seemed at least a little legit. Cathedral City needed a night guard for a park and ride structure. Best part is only 3 blocks from my house. So I figured at the very least if something happened, I figured I could run 3 blocks, right? But yeah, so I applied and within less than an hour, I got a call. The man at the other end, he seemed nice. He introduced himself as Gerald. He asked some pretty straightforward questions. He asked me about my experience, which I didn't have a whole lot. He asked me if I could follow instructions, which I told him I definitely could do. And then finally he asked me if I could start immediately, which I told him I could, but when I asked for the rate, he told me it was going to be 20 centi an hour for at least 6 hours a night, with possibility of overtime, maybe as late as 10 hours. So, I figured it was definitely worth it. After all, that was going to pay my rent after less than 3 days. So, I waited till the time was ready. I put on my best polo and my best pair of slacks, and I walked down to the structure. The structure wasn't much to look at. It was full of cars, even late at night. And honestly, it had that kind of smell those old structures have. You know, the smell of rusting metal and mildew. Yeah, that smell. It wasn't my favorite thing in this world, but I could live with it for 20 centi an hour. So, heading in, I found Gerald in the security box. So, in there, he began to explain my duties. Most of it was pretty straightforward. If I saw an illegal activity, I was to document it to the best of my abilities and call the police. If I saw a suspicious character but one not doing something illegal, I was to try to escort them off the premises. If they refused, I was also supposed to call the police. And most interestingly part of the job is occasionally I would have to go on patrol. Just kind of walk around and reassure people. Apparently people felt better when they saw a security guard around, and apparently it deterred some unsavory people from doing something. Honestly, that kind of made sense, but I didn't think that was that intimidating. But after he showed me the uniform and belt, which came with its own flashlight, walkie-talkie, and cell phone, I felt myself standing a little taller. And checking that little mirror he had in the stand, I certainly felt taller. Maybe it was going to work out pretty well. Next, Gerald explained that he would be my shadow for the day, and he would just guide me through what to do throughout the shift. And the next day he was going to leave me alone to see how it went. And if it would go well, he would hire me on for 4 nights a week. He was getting a little older, so he wanted to have a little more time with the family. Made sense to me, I guess. And honestly, 20 cents an hour? Who's going to turn that down? The first night was pretty good. No unsavory characters around, and the patrols were pretty straightforward. But then I noticed something. A young couple were approaching. The woman seemed drunk, and the man seemed oddly confident, and he was guiding her towards an alcove. I was about to say something when my manager grabbed my shoulder and whispered in my ear, "Don't say anything," he murmured to me. I was a bit confused, but I figured he knew better. So I continued my patrol, not saying anything to them. My manager walked alongside me, and once we were far enough away from them, he whispered in my ear, "We're gonna wait here. If we see the man leave after less than half an hour, we're gonna call the cleanup crew. if we see neither of them leave in 30 minutes, we're gonna have to call the police. I was definitely confused by this, but I figured again he was the boss. Less than 10 minutes later, the man was walking by and the woman was nowhere to be seen. He didn't even seem to notice that we were standing there. After that, the manager, Gerald, just kind of sighed, and he pulled out his cell phone and pressed a phone number before pulling it up to his lips. "Yeah, we need cleanup crew down here tonight." "Yeah, he got another one." After hanging up, Gerald guided me back to the guard box. Now, I was clearly very confused. Why do we need cleanup crew? Where's the woman? Did something happen to her? Gerald shook his head and sighed. "Trust me, you don't want to know. Just focus on what you need to for this job, because if you try to look into it, you're going to regret it." I followed his advice, at first at least. The cleanup crew arrived. They were in a large white van, carrying out hazmat suits and various cleaning supplies. They went down to the alcove, and after about an hour, they left with a large bag full of what I'm hoping was trash, and then left. Whatever happened there, I was just glad it didn't involve me. By the end of the shift, Gerald seemed clearly impressed. "You seem to have a real future here at the Park and Ride. So, tell you what. We'll hire you on for the 25 cents an hour, and as long as you don't ask too many questions about the alcove, you'll be fine." Now this definitely gave me another pause. 20 cents an hour was enough for me to just consider this job, but 25? I was going to make rent and then some. I could finally save up for that car. So, not asking any more questions, I shook his hand and just continued on with my work. As the weeks went by, it seemed like a pretty easy job. A couple times I've had to ask some drunk vagrants to leave. Once or twice I had to call the police when someone tried to break into a car. One time though, when I tried to ask someone to leave, they tried to start a fight with me. But I didn't let it happen, and I just let it de-escalate. But still, I kept seeing the man and his various dates come down there. It was the same man every time, but the woman was always different. Hell, sometimes it wasn't even a woman. Sometimes he'd bring a man down there, or various men, but always to the same alcove, and every time he would leave, always less than 30 minutes after he took him down there. And every time I would call the cleaning crew. I wasn't sure what I could do. It definitely was not worth my job going down there, and I figured whatever the hell was going on down there, I wasn't going to risk getting into a fight over it. Still though, I was curious enough. I checked all the cameras. Turns out the little park and ride had its own security cameras around the complex. While they certainly don't cover everything, they did help me out once or twice, making sure that people weren't around when they weren't supposed to be. Still, though, I was curious, and I figured a little curiosity wouldn't hurt. So, checking all the cameras, eventually I found one that actually covered the alcove. The alcove was remarkably clean. Apparently sending a cleaning crew down there every week would keep it clean. Like, who knew? Apparently regularly cleaning an area kept it clean. So, I just waited, and I checked on the alcove nightly to try to see if anything interesting would happen. Sometimes people would go down there, sometimes to sleep, sometimes to eat, sometimes to do other things. But so far, nothing I didn't expect. Then, though, one night I saw the man going down there with another new woman. This, I figured, would be my opportunity to see it. So, with my camera prepared on the alcove, I waited to see what would happen. The man guided the woman into the alcove. While in the alcove, which was very brightly lit, especially for the park and ride, He began to undress himself, and then the woman turned around and began to undress herself too. But what happened once the man's shirt came off was not quite what I was expecting. Underneath his shirt, he was definitely heavily scarred. It looked like that he had been shot multiple times, stabbed, and if I didn't know any better, it would look like a lot of brand marks. It formed a kind of leopard pattern scarring, and something that happened while the woman was getting undressed and turned away from him. The man seemed to grow. The man was definitely taller than when he first came into the alcove. And his face, something was different about it. The eyes seemed much, much larger, and more disturbingly, his eyes seemed to glow, like it had its own little iridescence in it. And the man's mouth, it opened wide, wider than any human mouth had any right to. And where the man normally would have had teeth, there were sharp fangs. And whatever his tongue was, it looked like it was extremely rough, like it was made of sandpaper. And then the pattern from the man's chest began to expand across his entire body. It even seemed to travel down his pants and what was left of his shoes. As he stood taller, his fingers began to sharpen and become more claw-like, and his face elongated just a little, and his nose seemed to flare out as it smelled the woman. The woman, who somehow didn't hear any of what was going on behind her, finally turned around, and whatever she was expecting, it was certainly not this man, or this beast, I guess. The beast opened its mouth wide and shot towards the woman. The woman was dead before she could even get a scream out. The beast tore into her chest like it was a ripe fruit. Her heart was still beating and clutched within its jaws. It squeezed down and blood flowed down its face and all over the cement. This creature was not a picky eater, and it was very, very messy. While it consumed her heart, it seemed to howl inside its alcove before it began to feast more on the woman's body. I felt so sick watching this, but I couldn't look away. I was afraid I would miss something if I did. The beast fed on her body for a few minutes before it stood on its hind legs again, and then it began to transform back into a man. The patterns shifted back to what they were before until they were just across the man's chest. He grabbed his shirt and put it back on. When the final button was up, his face was back to normal and his fingers were fingers again. He straightened his outfit, looked up at the camera like he knew I was watching, and he smiled. Even in his human form, his eyes still glowed, and his teeth were still fangs. Still, the man left as normal, and after I recovered from being sick, I called in the cleaning crew. Watching the cleaning crew work, I watched in horror as they, in utter boredom, cleaned the blood off the cement. They stuck the woman's body into a bag. They joked with each other, and they didn't even care about what they were cleaning up. It was just another day at the office for them. That day, after my shift ended, I spoke with my boss about that. Gerald didn't seem surprised about what happened. If anything, he seemed disappointed. I was hoping you didn't have to figure it out this way. Figure it out what way? The way by looking. There's a reason we tell you don't look. But why haven't we called the police? Why haven't we called anyone about this? Well, what are the police gonna do? Even if we did get the police down here, do you realize they're not gonna hurt that thing? We've called the police down here before. We've called the army down here before. Bullets don't seem to faze it, and men sure as hell don't. If we call the police down here, all we're gonna do is just get more people killed. So all we can do is give it a nice little place for it to kill 1 or 2 people every week. And then as long as it does that, it doesn't go out there hunting at night. And as long as we don't call anyone in, no one else has to get hurt. But it's still killing people. There's got to be something we can do. Do you think there is something we haven't tried yet? We've tried holy water. We've tried blades. We've tried total magic. We've tried holy magic. We've tried unholy magic. We've tried everything you can think of. We couldn't get rid of it. Well, what is it? Do you know what it is? Some people just call things like that shapeshifters. Others call them were-jaguars. My grandfather, he was an old-fashioned man. He referred to it as a Nahual. Wait, your grandfather knew about it? How did your grandfather know about it? This park and ride isn't that old. My grandfather, a long time ago, down in Tenochtitlan, was a farmer. But one day he found that thing coming out at night, and it attacked his brother. So he tried to kill it. The point was, it didn't work. He tried rallying the entire city against it. They still couldn't kill it. So my grandfather, out of desperation, moved up to Cathedral City, thinking that a city of God would keep it away. That thing, the Nahual, it followed him. And it's been following him. And when my grandfather finally died, it followed me. And that's why it's here. I found out that if I keep it fed, it doesn't stalk me. As for why it hasn't attacked me yet, I honestly don't know. Maybe it just seeks out food and we finally gave it a reliable source. All I know is I can't get rid of it, so I just do the best with what I have. I don't know what to do with this information. My manager sent me home that night with pay, and he gave me a couple of days to think it over. Reluctantly, I decided to keep the job because in those 2 days I couldn't come up with anything better than that. So it turns out finding a non-dangerous job in Cathedral City isn't easy. Finding a non-dangerous, good-paying job is flat out impossible. Still, I went back. That day, though, the Nahual already came back. I wasn't used to the Nahual returning so quickly. I was used to it coming about once a week, but twice in 1 week? That had been unheard of, even if it sometimes ate more than one person a night. Still, though, it came back, and it brought a little girl with it. It held the little girl's hand, and it guided her towards the alcove. That night was the closest I'd ever gotten to actually calling the police on it. I couldn't help but feel like there was something I could do. There had to be something. Maybe they just needed a silver bullet, or wolfsbane, or something. anything so that way a little girl didn't have to die. Maybe I could have done something. But looking at that camera and watching those two go into the alcove, I remembered how just a week before it took an entire gang of bikers down into the alcove. I also remember how it left in less than 5 minutes. And that mess took more than one van to fix. So, knowing that there was nothing I could do, I just watched the camera outside the alcove, making a promise to myself I wouldn't actually look to see what happened inside. After about 20 minutes, the little girl left the alcove, which was, well, it's never happened before. Nothing had ever escaped the Nahual before. I left it alone for a while. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, even an hour afterwards, and still no Nahual. So I checked the camera, and immediately after seeing what was inside the alcove, I almost got sick again and immediately switched off the camera. Once then, I called the cleanup crew immediately. After they cleaned it all up, I brought the camera back up and rewinded it back to when the Nahual brought the little girl into the alcove. It started like everything else did. The Nahual brought her into the alcove. It looked like he leaned down to tell her they were going to play hide and seek. She turned to face the corner with her hands covering her eyes. She was probably going to count to 10 or something. And the Nahual began his changes like he always did. And when the girl was done counting, she turned around to face the feline beast. But instead of being scared or even worried, she just seemed excited. She clapped her hands and ran up to the Nahual like she was going to pet it. It responded in about the way you expected it to. It raised a paw and then swiped at her, knocking her against the wall. As it stalked closer and closer, something began to happen to the camera. The lights in the alcove, they flickered. Now, I know when you imagine a park and ride structure, you imagine dark or dingy lights, a lot of bugs, and lights covered in cobwebs. For most of the structure, that is the case. But in this alcove, it had been cleaned and maintained so well that it was practically brand new. Still, these lights were flickering, and it seemed like the little girl was being covered in TV static. The Nahual crouched down like it was about to pounce, and then when the lights flickered off, it pounced towards the little girl. But when the light flickered on, the little girl was no longer there, and something else stood in its place. I don't know how to describe what I saw, because even going back to that image again and again and again, it was like whatever it was made of distorted green TV static. I could tell it had goat-like legs, it had strong arms, and it had sharp claws, even sharper than the Nahual's it seemed. And it stood even taller than the beast, and its horns practically scraped the ceiling. Even when I went into the alcove at a later date, I could still see where those horns scraped. This demonic beast picked up the Nahual by its neck when it pounced towards where it was. Wherever the little girl was, she was gone, replaced by this abomination. This creature pressed the narwhal against the wall by its neck, and even though the camera could have no sound, it looked like the narwhal was whimpering. This creature that had followed a single family for decades across the entire continent of Vespucci, and it was whimpering. I always thought of it as this unstoppable apex predator, and here I was looking at it whimpering like it was trying to get this abomination's mercy. But whatever pounded through this thing's heart, it was not mercy. This demon held the narwhal to the wall with one hand against its throat, and with another hand, it punched through the cement of the alcove and began to twist and pull the rebar out of the wall. With its impromptu stake of steel and rust, it stabbed the narwhal, first through its throat. The narwhal tried to grasp at its throat where it was pierced, trying to get this rough, ugly death out of it. But it was all for naught. The demon pulled another rebar and then took the narwhal's paw and then stabbed it into the wall. And then it took the same thing for the other paw and then its two legs. And then it twisted the ends of the rebar. That way it couldn't slide out. I could tell the narwhal was in pain. It seemed to be in utter agony from the demon's treatment. But it didn't seem to faze the demon. Now the demon became covered in more static and the lights in the room flickered again. Soon where the demon stood, the little girl was once again. And then she skipped out of the room, a flower in hand and no blood on her clothes. That night, I thought of the food web. Everyone's heard of the food chain before. You know, deer eats grass, wolf eats deer, wolf dies and then becomes grass. You know, a food chain where everything goes around in a circle. But in school, we learned that a food chain wasn't quite accurate way of looking at things, and that there was something else called the food web. Essentially, a bunch of different things could wind up eating the same thing. A deer could be eaten by a bear. It could be eaten by a wolf. It could be eaten by a fox in certain situations. It could be eaten by a wild dog. It could be eaten by a coyote. It could be eaten by a wild tiger. It could be eaten by a mountain lion. But the point is that there were many different predators just for the deer. And any one of these predators could easily turn on each other. A bear could eat a wolf. A team of wolves could take down a bear. A mountain lion could eat a wolf. So on and so forth. The point is there was no true top of the pyramid. Just things that ate other things. So, whatever the narwhal was, it was like a jaguar hunting a deer. Sure, it's powerful and it's strong, it's clever, and it's sneaky as all hell. But the thing is about being a sneaky predator, it's not the only one in the woods. So it thought it was chasing prey, but what it was actually chasing was another predator. If I was to name the kind of predator this demonic little girl was, I would call her a snake. Something that was lying in wait until just the right opportunity to strike. But the worst part of the video wasn't how the narwhal was killed. No. Despite all the rebar in its throat and its arms and its legs, it still did not die. It did not die for a long, long time. And by the time it did finally give out its last choking breath, the cleaning crew had only just arrived. That was almost enough for me to give up my job again. But I looked away from the camera and back in my office to see if maybe I could make myself forget what I had saw. What I wasn't expecting in my guardhouse was to see the little girl again. She was just sitting on my counter, just kicking her legs like any other girl just sitting on a counter. Needless to say, I almost screamed, and she just giggled at that. You're funny. So did you like my little kitty friend? I looked at her like she was crazy. Your kitty friend? Yeah, the Nahual. He's silly. He actually thought he could hurt me. Too bad he had to be put down. Put down? You mean that's what you did? No, silly. I didn't put him down. My daddy did. Your daddy put him down. Yes, silly. Okay, so your daddy put Mr. Nahual down, but was there a reason why? Well, silly. There was no reason for Mr. Nahual to stay, but he just got greedy. He just kept eating and eating and eating. He got spoiled and he forgot to hunt. So we just got rid of him. Okay, you got rid of him, but if he was supposed to hunt, what do you mean by that? The little girl held up a couple photographs for me, throwing them to me. I barely managed to catch them before they fell to the ground. The little girl just chuckled again. Silly. Well, I think these will answer your question, but I'm not gonna stay in Cathedral City any longer. Okay, you're not staying in Cathedral City. I didn't want to admit it, but this actually brought me a lot of relief. Who wanted an insane little girl and her demonic dad to just stay in Cathedral City, let alone in a place so close to me? Of course, silly, I'm leaving. Just know that we will be back. You'll be back. Yes. Do you know when? No. Well, then how do you know you're going to be back? Oh, I know. Because it's always good to visit your friends again. The little girl got down from the counter and then began to walk out of the guardhouse. Wait, what's your name, little girl? She turned around and stuck her tongue out at me for a second before she skipped away again. My name's Flora, silly. And I haven't seen her since, but her words still worry me. As for the pictures, well, they were old and gray. In one picture, it looked like it was the Nahual. Looked like it must have been taken like 60 years ago, and judging from the environment, it was some kind of floating garden it was taken on. Floating gardens aren't very common in the Seven Cities, but they're much more common down in Tenochtitlan. And the next photo bothered me a lot more, because the picture was a Nahual next to a man that looked just like my manager. On the back of the photo was a couple of lines that finally convinced me that my manager was definitely hiding something more from me. Two brothers, one in mourning and one lost to tragedy. You will never be forgotten. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed The Legend of the Nahual. It has been a creature I've been wanting to do for a while, and Cathedral City is a setting I've been wanting to do. I hope you enjoyed the return of Flora and her father Faunus, and do not worry, they will return. Have a good rest of your night.